protests in cities all across China, sparked by opposition to the government's strict COVID lockdowns.
This is probably the worst day for Xi Jinping.
Nawoływania do ustąpienia Xi Jinpinga.
Biggest political crisis he has had to face.
Xi Jinping must go. This is what the Chinese have chanted and continue to chant during the nationwide protests taking place in China. In China, there are a lot of protests and strikes during the year, but these usually relate to economic issues or working conditions. This time, almost for the first time in many years, a completely different slogan appears, which may come as a surprise to many. The messages were about the surrender of power by the Communist Party. This is a serious indictment for the governments in Beijing, which are now faced with many problems at once. The most important of them are the still present problems with coronavirus in this country and the so-called zero COVID policy. The Chinese see what is happening in the West and that the world has ended the fight against the pandemic. However, Chinese authorities fed the society with the propaganda of success, where hundreds of thousands of people were supposed to die in Western countries, and China was supposed to be a peaceful and safe place.
Well, China is battling a surge in COVID cases, and new media reports could reveal the vast scale of the outbreak. Bloomberg and the Financial Times have reported around 250 million people were infected during the first weeks of December, citing a leaked government document.
The thing is, even Beijing itself knows that its vaccination program has proven ineffective. Relying on the opinions of experts, lifting the restrictions would mean the death of up to 1 million citizens. It would be an incredible failure on the side of the communist authorities in Beijing, which have the best system in which one party dictates the conditions. Let's remember that in China there are also social media. One of them is the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, Sina Weibo and YouTube, Youku. Of course, all of them are scrupulously censored. However, not everything is able to be captured by algorithms, and even controllers with a large social agitation cannot cope with it. The problem of censorship in China has returned for the first time in a long time, and the protest is large and extremely effective. Students, but also much older people, simply hold a white sheet of paper. The authorities cannot ban it, but they try anyway and spare no one, not even a BBC journalist who was severely beaten while covering this event. These protests are unlikely to lead to the downfall of China's Communist Party anytime soon, but in the long run, it could lead to some changes in China. That's why today I decided to analyze for you how what is currently happening in China will affect the global economy in the face of the crisis, and what are the chances of overthrowing governments in China, and whether there is ever a chance for democracy there. Just a month ago, with the release of this episode in early December 2022, Xi Jinping was anointed as General Secretary of the Communist Party of China for a third term. In the high echelons of power, the old Politburo Committee, the Politburo and the Xi Central Committee, filled with his loyal supporters. His predecessor Hu Jintao was publicly expelled from the party Congress under the scrutiny of international media, probably as a staging of the indisputable power of Xi. There are many indications that the Chinese themselves claim that their president violates the existing rules of the constitution, because it indicated until 2018, until Xi introduced changes, that the leader of the country cannot hold this function for more than 2 terms. This rule did not function only for Mao Zedong's rule. However, let's face it, these are rather bad associations, and it's not like these wiser Chinese listened to Mao Zedong's Red Sun to remember the beautiful times that were then. By many historians, Mao is considered the greatest criminal in the history of mankind. He is credited with the death of 5 to 70 million people, only in peacetime, among other things, by the so-called Great Leap Forward, the plan to implement the State of the Middle, which finally ended in failure due to irrational norms imposed by the regime. But it's not exactly 0-1 either, because the poorer Chinese, speaking especially of the young unemployed, believe that now bad capitalists, i.e. enterprising Chinese making their fortunes, are enemy number 1. This is how Mao built his power at the turn of the 1940s-50 of the last century. Anyway, even on the Chinese equivalent of the Quora Forum, you can find questions: who, in your opinion, was one of the greatest people in history? And here is the answer to the Chinese. Both Mao's opponents and his supporters are slowly starting to unite one common enemy, Xi Jinping. The growth force of the Chinese economy is slowly starting to run out, and year after year, since the Xi took power, the dynamics of development slows down. Now housing problems, increasing censorship and general dissatisfaction with the situation in the country also came into play. In addition, ordinary Chinese complain about inflation, which is mixed with falling real estate prices and possible collapses of the largest developers. It is worth noting that the model of previous growth in this country is based to some extent on them. No wonder Beijing is pumping another $140 billion into this sector. The thing is that the whole situation is a bit like a bottomless sack or a rotting wound on which a band-aid is stuck. This year could have brought a recession to the Chinese economy. It turned out, however, that this did not come, and even another year in a row there is an increase. Except that 2023 may coincide with events that will become almost unmanageable for the Chinese Communist Party. This gives rise to a chance for some change, but one step at a time. Social tensions especially increased in late November, when at least 10 people were killed in the city of Urumqi after a fire on Thursday, November 24th. This is where many residents are under strict lockdown, resulting from the zero COVID policy. It clearly states that the appearance of even one case of illness is to result in the isolation of the entire apartment, block of flats, and in extreme cases, the entire housing estate or city. Where there is a case and no hospitalization is required, quarantine is to take place there. Thus, the sick, even in the factory, cannot leave it together with other employees until all of them receive negative test results. It is precisely such unreasonable regulations that led to the fire killing people because the fire brigade did not arrive on time due to lockdowns. And the block itself was supposed to be especially closed. This sparked outrage and sparked protests in many parts of China. Unusual in them are not only the slogans and the brutality of the authorities when trying to pacify them, but also the scale of this undertaking. For the first time in many years, the protests concern the power itself and are spread out in different parts of the country, as you can see now on the map. So, in their own way, they are bottom-up organized, and even if they do not lead to major changes, which I sincerely doubt at the moment, they show the Chinese that despite strong repression, a certain rebellion is still possible. Therefore, under favorable conditions, communists or at least Xi can be pulled away from power, and this may prove necessary at some stage because he himself begins to slowly fall into the cult of personality. At the protests, there are also people singing the anthem from the times of the Republic of China and, at the moment, few voices in favor of greater freedom or even democracy. This one, contrary to appearances, could be adapted quite easily in China. Every 3 years, all rural people in China elect their village chiefs and members of village committees in free democratic elections. According to the 2020 census, there are 510 million people living in the countryside. In other words, 36% of the Chinese population can systematically participate in democratic elections in which they elect about 1 million of their representatives. In theory, changing the authorities at the top and allowing the existence of some official factions within the party would be enough to slowly introduce a certain freedom in China. However, it is difficult to talk about democracy at the moment, because there is still a long way to go.